Hey class, welcome to chapter 3, which is all about psychological assessment. Let's start off today by first taking a look in your books at how this chapter starts, which is with one of the case studies. I think this is kind of a good way to follow through the chapter, is to have this case to refer back to, so that's what we're going to do. This is a case for a client named Ben Robsham, who is a 22-year-old Caucasian male and was referred for an assessment at his employer's EAP by his supervisor following an incident in which he hit his head while operating a subway train. When driving above ground, Ben reported that the brakes had jammed while he was coming to an intersection where pedestrians were crossing. Using the emergency brake, Ben was able to stop the train, but the abrupt halt caused him to hit his head on the glass window and temporarily lose consciousness. He is unable to recall what happened directly after hitting his head. Ben took a 2-week leave of absence after the incident and avoided going to work for an additional 2 weeks. When his supervisor called him, Ben stated, "I can't leave my house. They'll come and get me." Relevant history is Ben has no history of psychiatric treatment. He stated that he has never experienced depression or anxiety and that he typically feels, quote, "just fine," which has made the recent changes in his psychological state all the more disturbing to him. Ben reported that he has never used drugs and only occasionally drinks when he is in a social environment. Additionally, Ben reported that his maternal grandfather and uncle had both been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Finally, Ben reported having no remarkable past or current medical history. Case formulation. Because Ben's symptoms emerged following the incident, Ben will be referred for neuropsychological testing to rule out possible traumatic brain injury. Diagnosis. Rule out mild neurocognitive disorder due to traumatic brain injury with behavioral disturbance. And treatment plan. After an initial intake interview at the Employee Assistance Program, Ben was referred for further psychological evaluation and psychiatric consultation to Dr. Antoine Washington, a neuropsychologist. The tests administered by Dr. Washington are in Table 1. So then take a look at Table 1, and you'll see there the clinical interview, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, 4th edition, trail making test, parts A and B, clock drawing test, paced auditory serial addition test, Boston naming test, Wechsler memory scale, and Minnesota multiphasic personality inventory 2. Or the MMPI-2. Okay, so we're going to talk about all those different tests that were administered to Ben and how one goes about making a thorough assessment. So a psychological assessment refers to a broad range of measurement techniques, all of which involve having people provide scorable information about their psychological functioning. A common use of assessment procedures, of course, is to provide a diagnosis, or at least a tentative diagnosis of a psychological disorder. But also think about times where it might be useful to have a psychological assessment in other situations, like, for instance, in a forensic assessment, where the psychologist is determining whether or not the client was in a functioning state of mind when they committed a criminal offense. So that's just something to think about. Going back to Ben, this process is really important because we need to figure out exactly what's going on. I think the really relevant information in that little blurb about Ben is that, yes, these symptoms appeared after he hit his head, but there is a history of schizophrenia in his family. So those things signify the need for a really thorough assessment to figure out exactly what course of treatment to pursue. For traumatic brain injuries, also really important that treatment begins early for the best possible outcome, and the same thing is true for schizophrenia. So whatever's going on, we want to make sure that Ben's getting immediate help for this. So then when we think about putting together these assessments, we read down that whole list of tests that were administered, and going back to what we have learned, again, touching on the importance of what makes a good psychological test, that it's reliable, valid, and standardized. So to be reliable, remember the test should produce the same results regardless of when it is given, and the individual should answer items within the same subscale of a test in reasonably similar fashion. And the validity of a test reflects the extent to which a test measures what it is designed to measure. So for instance, an intelligence test should hopefully be measuring intelligence, right? Not personality. Then we're going to talk about standardization. So standardization clearly specifies a test instructions for administration and scoring. So that means that each test is administered and scored in the same way. That's standardized, right? So again, it would make no sense and the results would not mean anything if there wasn't a standard way that these tests were being given and scored. Also, again, just going to put a little plug in here for remembering on top of the validity and reliability of a test, again, thinking about cultural background and diversity in how people might be interpreting these tests and what their answers might be showing. So always remembering that cultural awareness and that background information. So another thing to keep in mind is there's something that's been dubbed the Barnum effect, and it's named after the legendary circus owner P.T. Barnum. And what this refers to is the tendency for clinicians to formulate cases and unintentionally make generic or vague statements about client behavior. So that would be like if you think of when you get a fortune cookie and you read your fortune and how it can apply to really anybody. So of course it could apply to you. The same thing can be true in these assessments. The clinician needs to be careful not to make overly generic statements about behavior, because that doesn't really help with any information about what that client's actually going through, and doesn't help narrow the symptoms down. So I think there's a fine line, because I think it's also important to not be overly specific, and to always keep in mind, you know, writing formulations up in such a way that that it won't be harmful for the client to read. So always making sure that while there's specific information about behavior and what the client is experiencing, that there's also some respect for confidentiality, and also making sure that the client is being portrayed, you know, as a human. I think that's very important to remember. So one way to ensure that this Barnum effect doesn't take place is to make sure that clinicians are using the best assessment methods possible. And this goes back to, we talked a little bit about this last week, right? Evidence-based treatment. So again, going back to this when we're talking about assessment as well, evidence-based assessment. So the principles of evidence-based assessment are relying on research findings and scientifically viable theories, using psychometrically strong measures, and empirically evaluating the assessment process. So that helps narrow things down, and that is really on the clinician. That's part of our job as clinicians, is to make sure that we're staying up with new evidence-based assessments and treatments, and making sure that what we are using has not been replaced by something that's much better and much you know, more valid or more reliable. So that is very important. Okay, moving on. We're going to talk about the clinical interview next. So typically the assessment starts with a clinical interview, and there's a couple different varieties here. But basically, a clinical interview is a series of questions in a face-to-face interaction with the client. The answers that the client provides gives really important background information so that the clinician can make a really thorough and well done formulation. So it's basically just sitting down with your client and asking questions about different aspects of their life, including family, socioeconomic, work, education, substance use, all those kind of things. So you're bringing in the whole picture of the client. The least formal version of a clinical interview is an unstructured interview, and this involves a series of open-ended questions. So this is more like a conversation, and this can give the client the opportunity to kind of start to build some rapport with the clinician. And it's up to the clinician also to, if there's an open-ended question that's asked and the client comes back with a one-word answer, then it's up to the clinician in the unstructured interview to come up with more open-ended questions to help the client become more detailed and share more. And that's important to remember when you're thinking about how this looks, because as you can imagine, and maybe some of you have been to see a therapist, but when you first go in to meet with a therapist or a psychologist and any kind of clinician, and they're asking you some pretty personal questions, sometimes it can be hard to just, spill the beans all the way and be totally open. So it's really important as clinicians that we make sure that we're asking open-ended questions and then asking further, asking for more detail, and definitely making the client feel like there's a real interest there, so that they know that it's not just reading down a list of questions. In the unstructured interview, it can also be really helpful and important to observe the client's behavior. So a lot of nonverbal observations and clues are going on during this interview as well, looking for symptoms and signs of things to be aware of, like having difficulty sitting still, tapping a foot, not being able to maintain eye contact, maybe tearing up and crying throughout the interview, speaking really quietly. All of these things are good things to pay attention to in the interview so that you can start making a solid formulation of what's going on, and also ask the client what's going on through those observations. So you can see information sought through interviews include reasons for being in treatment, symptoms, health status, family background, life history. Okay. If you look on page 54 in your book, there's also a table that's a little more specific about areas covered in a clinical interview. So you can see age and sex, reason for referral, education and work, current social situation, physical and mental health history, drug, alcohol use, family history, behavioral observations. Okay. And this unstructured interview can take, anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours, I would say, depending on what the client shares and how much information the clinician feels is necessary. So let's go back to Ben here and let's look at some things that were relevant in his clinical interview. So as Dr. Washington is continuing to obtain more detailed information from Ben from his referral from the first clinician he saw, Ben stated that he has difficulty concentrating, and his main symptom is the occurrence of very strange thoughts that have been quite troubling to him. Specifically, he stated that he feels too afraid to leave his apartment because he believes that the police will apprehend and arrest him as punishment for what he did. He worries that others blame him for killing people in the incident, and that if he returned to work, the passengers would turn on him, thus resulting in his apprehension. He states that he spends several hours a day worrying about the consequences of the incident and sometimes hears accusatory voices blaming him for hurting people and telling him that he is a monster. He reported that he has only heard these voices a few times in the past few weeks, and as it turned out, no one was injured in the accident. Another really important part of this clinical interview is in this next statement, because even though Ben is describing some distress about these psychological problems, he's also denied any thoughts of hurting himself or any suicidal ideation. This is always a very important part of the clinical interview, is to assess somebody's safety. So always important to ask if there are any thoughts of self-harm and if there is any suicidal ideation. If the answer is yes, it's very important to discuss with suicidal ideation specifically if there's a plan and if there's intent, and then move forward from there to ensure your client's safety. And with self-harm, same thing, trying to create an atmosphere where you can help your client sort of immediately make commitments to trying other distress tolerance behaviors other than self-harm. So those are really important things to ask in this clinical interview. Ben's also reporting that he's having frequent nightmares, and also that he's been really too embarrassed to tell anyone about these thoughts because he's been worried that he's going crazy. And I think that again goes back to some of that stigma that still exists around mental illness and the fear that people have about seeking help. So as you can see, as we're talking about Ben, this clinical interview is really important because it's given Dr. Washington a great deal of background information and more specific information about what exactly Ben is going through. If you just had Ben fill out a piece of paper on his own without doing the interview, it would be unlikely that he would share all of this detailed information. So then the other option is a structured interview, and this consists of a standardized series of questions with predetermined wording and order. One of the most widely used clinical interviews is the structured clinical interview for DSM-5 disorders, and this is presented in Table 3 of your book on page 56. And the questions in this are worded in standard form, but the interviewer chooses which questions to ask based on the client's answers to previous questions. So for example, if a client states that she experiences symptoms of anxiety, the interviewer would follow up with specific questions about these symptoms. One advantage of a structured interview is it is a systematic approach and is less subject to variations among clinicians than an unstructured interview. And also anyone with the proper training in this instrument can administer it, not necessarily only licensed mental health professionals, as is true for interviews that require more clinical judgment. So because this one's more standardized and sort of just ask these questions and here's the outcome, it doesn't take as much clinical expertise. So Table 3 here, so if somebody comes in and is experiencing symptoms of depression, the structured interview would look something like this. So I'm going to ask you some more questions about your mood. In the last month, has there been a period of time where you were feeling depressed or down most of the day, nearly every day? And what was that like? Okay, and as you can see then, looking over here at the criteria, so if the answer is yes, I've been feeling that way most of the day, every day, that's going to meet criteria number 1 for major depressive disorder, which is depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, as indicated either by subjective report or observation. And then kind of going on down that list of the criteria from the DSM and just interviewing the client about, you know, what their symptoms have been to determine if they do meet criteria for a diagnosis of major depression. Another thing is, sorry. Oh geez. Hold on, guys. There we go. Okay. Clinical interview. Next, we're going to talk about this little mental status examination. So this is really to assess appearance, attitudes, behavior, mood and affect, speech, thought process, content of thought, perception, cognition, insight, and judgment. The outcome is a comprehensive description of how the client looks, thinks, feels, and behaves. Okay, so that's another important part, because if a client comes in and says that they're feeling fine, but they can't stop crying, right, that would be a good indication that something's going on that they're not sharing, and without doing the mental status examination, that would be something that could be missed. So that's really important. And then you have a mini mental state examination, and this is a structured tool that clinicians can use as a brief screening device to assess neurocognitive disorders. So a mini mental state exam, MMSE, would include questions like, please tell me what day of the week it is, what day of the month it is, what city we're in, what town we're in, what building we're in, those types of things. Also, maybe a question with some simple arithmetic to see if a client is able to make calculations in their head. And then also might include a demonstration of the client's ability to read a short sentence and also write a short sentence, and also follow a command. So, you know, writing down on a piece of paper, for instance, please stand up, and asking the client to read aloud what it says and follow what it says. And that's just a test to make sure that your client is going to be able to follow everything that you're going to be presenting in treatment, and making sure that you don't need to make special accommodations for them. Talked about that. Okay. Now we're going to talk about intelligence testing, which again, if you, like I said, I'm sure all of you have at this point, taken general psychology, then you're a little bit familiar with this because there's a section in that class, a whole chapter in which we discuss this. So some of this will be a little bit of review, but that's okay. Doesn't hurt to just touch back up on it. So uses of intelligence testing is to create an overall cognitive evaluation, diagnosis of learning disability, determination of giftedness, prediction of future academic achievement, diagnosis of neurological and psychiatric disorders, evaluation of the potential of employees. Okay. So really we're going to talk about these two intelligence tests, which the Stanford-Binet intelligence test is commonly known as the IQ test. And then we also have the Wechsler intelligence scales. So the Stanford-Binet is given to children, and this is calculated by converting their raw scores to standardized scores that reflect where a child stands in relation to others of similar age and gender. The average deviation IQ score is set at 100 with a standard deviation of 15. If a child receives an SB5 IQ score, Stanford-Binet 5th edition, of 115, this means the child stands at or above the IQ of 84% of the population. Okay. Also, the SB5 also scores on measures that include fluid reasoning, knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial reasoning, and working memory. You can see this, these scales and definitions on page 57, table 4 in your textbook. So you can see their types of abilities assessed by the Stanford-Binet. Okay, so then we're going to talk about the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. This is so the counterpart. This one is specifically for adults, okay? And this was originally developed in 1939 and first published in 1955. So it's now in its 4th edition, which is why you'll see that 4 after the title there. Really, Wechsler was seeking to develop a tool for use in clinical settings that could provide an adjunct to diagnoses of psychopathology. He believed that it was so important to include both verbal and nonverbal tests. Originally, he labeled these two verbal and performance. And for many years, that's how clinicians would report the outcomes of these. So now with the 4th edition, includes new tests and a completely revamped scoring system, which we'll take a look at. So here you go. Here are the different scales: verbal comprehension of the 4th edition, verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And here is what the structure of this test looks like, okay? So here you have your full scale IQ, which is the sort of coming together of all of these different subsets, okay? And this full scale IQ reflects general cognitive functioning and is the best single predictor of school achievement of all the scales on this test. Okay, and then beneath that are the 4 index scores of verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. Okay, so verbal comprehension includes vocabulary, information, comprehension, and similarities. So something, for example, like define the word barrel, or how many minutes are there in an hour, okay? Perceptual reasoning is matrix reasoning. So this is puzzles, block design, picture completion. For example, choose which pattern logically follows after a set of patterns. Arrange a set of blocks so that they can reproduce a design. Working memory is digit span forward, digit span backward, letter number sequencing. So recalling a series of digits in forward order, recalling a series of digits in backward order, or recalling a set of mixed letters and numbers from largest to smallest. And then processing speed is symbol search and coding. So copy numbers that match symbols into appropriate boxes for existence. So also important to just take note again of the ability for clinicians to be observing behavior during this test, which is good when you're thinking about gaining diagnostic information that could complement the test scores, okay? Now let's take a look here in your book at what this might actually look like. So on page 60, in table 6, you'll see our guy Ben's scores on this test, okay? Going through, we'll see that he has his full scale IQ was a 115, indicating that he has above average level of performance because it's higher than 84% of the population, okay? However, if you look at the entire pattern of his scores, you'll see that he demonstrated really high variability among the index scores. So this suggests a wide range to Ben's cognitive abilities. Specifically noteworthy that Ben's processing speed was low, suggesting that he struggles with the perception of visual patterns and stimuli, specifically when speed is a factor. So trouble under pressure to get that done. This suggests possible injury to the areas of his brain involved in processing of spatial information. Okay. Also, just here's a little example too of Dr. Washington carefully recording Ben's behaviors. So again, helping to provide that full-fledged assessment and noting that Ben had some frustration, although was determined to complete the test. He took a great deal of time to complete the final block design and stated it doesn't make sense, there aren't enough blocks. And you can then read further on page 60 some more examples of how Ben's behavior in answering the questions also offer valuable insight as opposed to just looking at the numbers without putting those pieces in. Okay? So now we're going to talk about personality testing, which as we are moving through this, thinking about really bringing this all together. So you have intelligence testing, also personality testing to make a really comprehensive assessment, okay? So two kinds here, self-report and projective, okay? We're going to start out by spending some time here talking about one of the most widely used self-report inventory, which is the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. So a self-report inventory contains standardized questions with fixed response categories that the test taker completes independently, either on paper or via tablet, laptop, or computer. Okay. This test, the MMPI, going back to that, was originally published in 1943, and currently the version that is used is from 1989, which is the MMPI-2. It includes 567 true-false items, all in the form of statements that describe the individual's thoughts, behaviors, feelings, and attitudes. And if you look at Table 7 in your textbook, you can see different clinical scales, type of content, and adapted item. So let's look at the one here for depression there, number 2. So type of content would be unhappiness and feelings of low personal worth. Adapted item, so this would be what would be on the inventory as a true or false question. I wish I were as happy as others appear to be. So that would be true or false. Obviously, if that statement is true, that would signify potential tendency towards more depressed feelings. And so take a look at that table and all the different contents there and the adapted item. So after its publication, researchers and clinicians became aware of limitations in the MMPI clinical scale scores. Okay, these scores did not correspond to them to the original clinical categories, which means that the test administrators could not interpret them as evidence of specific diagnoses. So for instance, just because there was a high rating on a schizophrenia scale on this test, that did not imply necessarily that the individual had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So because of that, clinicians are now incorporating the newest version of the MMPI, which is the MMPI-2RF. So this is published in 2008 and is based entirely on the restructured scales. Containing only 338 items, this latest version of the test also provides scores for higher order factors that indicate a client's overall emotional, cognitive, and behavioral functioning. Okay? So then look on page 62, take a look at Table 8, and you'll see clinical scales of the MMPI-2RF. So as opposed to the table that we're seeing these clinical scales on the MMPI with adapted items, we're now looking at scale names that are a little broader. So instead of depression, for instance, we're looking at low positive emotions, right, and cynicism, dysfunctional negative emotions. So a little different there in how they are labeling these and interpreting them. Okay. A couple other ones to maybe just keep in mind that are also self-report measures. One is the Personality Assessment Inventory, and this consists of 344 items that are organized into 11 clinical scales, 5 treatment scales, 2 interpersonal scales, and 4 validity scales. This is handy to use with clients who might have a language or reading barrier that makes it difficult to complete the MMPI too. We also have the SCL-90R, which is the measures the test taker's current experiencing of 90 physical and psychological problems. And this focuses on the client's current status rather than asking about symptoms over a previous amount of time. So, going back to Ben again, if you flip over in your book to page 64 and 65, you can take a look at what this would actually look like. So this would be Ben's profile. And reading through it as you're looking at it to interpret it, you can see slightly elevated scores on the paranoia scale and his endorsement of several critical items relating directly to psychosis, such as "I have no enemies who really wish me harm." He marked that false. "I have strange and peculiar thoughts," true, and at times my